Good morning everyone, Mr. Boff here. We've got a new poem to examine today. Continuing our work around poetry, we've looked at quite a range of poems, particularly in the run-up to lockdown before school closed. What I want to do is sort of continue the work we're doing around mother to son, and continue this idea of exploring poems that make use of extended metaphors, okay? Because I think that would be a really rich way of thinking about certain poems. It's also an opportunity for us to, as a result, look at a whole series of fantastic poems too. So lots of different reasons why we would do this. We've got a poem here by Simon Armitage, the poet who also wrote The Manhunt, okay? It's quite a famous poem by him. A very, very moving poem. So as ever, the first thing we need to do is to read through it. I'll read it out, but you will also probably need to pause the video and read through the poem again yourself, maybe one, even two or three more times. This poem, incidentally, is from a collection of poems called Book of Matches, and each of the poems is designed to be read in the length of time it takes a match to burn. So these are kind of shorter poems. Doesn't mean that they're not rich and interesting and thought-provoking and so on. This very moving poem, as you might have guessed even just from the title. So, Mother, Any Distance. Mother, any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. You come to help me measure windows, pelmets, doors, the acres of the walls, the prairies of the floors. You at the zero end, me with the spool of tape, recording length, reporting meters, centimetres, back to base, then leaving up the stairs, the line still feeding out, unreeling years between us, anchor, kite. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms, climb the ladder to the loft, to breaking point, where something has to give. 2 floors below, your fingertips still pinch the last 1/100th of an inch. I reach towards a hatch that opens on an endless sky to fall or fly. Okay, so beautiful poem. Like I say, need to read it through again. Lots going on here, okay, and probably helpful at this particular moment to consider and reconsider and remind ourselves what we mean by an extended metaphor. So remember, a metaphor is a form of comparison where we compare something very directly to something else. Okay, two unrelated things, we compare them directly. Okay, so great example, it's raining cats and dogs. It's raining cats and dogs. It's not obviously literally raining cats and dogs. We are comparing heavy rainfall to a situation where it's almost as if, you know, the rain is so heavy that there are cats and dogs falling from the sky. Okay, now that's expressed not as a simile. It's, you know, the rain is so heavy, it's like the rain is cats and dogs. It's expressed as a metaphor. It's raining cats and dogs. And there's a kind of direct intensity about metaphors. We've watched a short animation that explores this idea that metaphors, we feel a metaphor, whereas a simile, using like or as, it's something that feels a little bit more cerebral, causes us to think. But a metaphor, you sort of feel it in your bones or in your heart. Okay. Again, I've already started speaking in metaphors. You can't feel anything in your bones. Okay, that doesn't make sense, does it? And yet, we sort of know what it means. We sort of feel it in a kind of deeper, in the core of our being. So we think in metaphors. Metaphors are absolutely everywhere. In fact, you could probably make a pretty compelling case that metaphors are the way we think and organise our understanding of the world. So they're really, really important. And this is a highly metaphorical, or we could also say a highly figurative poem. And what we've got here is it has an implied narrative. Okay, so think of the setting as a mother and her son. The son's moved into a new home, and the mother is helping him measure up and organise his new place. Okay. And think about that, the child moving out of the mother's home. Think about how the mother would be feeling. Think about how the adult child would be feeling. We could probably see this as quite a personal poem by Simon Armitage. I'm normally very cautious about suggesting that, but it does feel hyper-personal as a poem. Okay, and let's work through this and think very carefully about this central image. Okay, So we've got, if we just have a look at this middle stanza, we've got this idea of measuring. And if you think about the tape measure as a sort of visual metaphor, that the mother at one end of the tape measure, the son at the other end of the tape measure, and that tape measure is being extended out over the course of the house. Think about the mother's position being fixed, and then the son, the child, or the adult now, pulling further and further on that tape measure. That's not just a simple act of just measuring up. It's become a metaphor. It's become a metaphor for growing up, for moving further and further away from one's parent, and yet still needing them to be, kind of tethering you like an anchor at the other end. Okay? So it says mother. So this feels very personal. Addressed to the mother. Possibly formal. Hard to say with the use of the word mother rather than say mum. Okay, mother. Any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. We've got, and this is very typical of Simon Armitage, we've got this kind of colloquial language. Armitage sees poetic value in ordinary everyday language. He sees poetic potential in ordinary everyday language. Used to be the case in a couple of hundred years ago that poetic language was seen as sort of separate and very different to ordinary everyday language. Over time, the boundary between those two things has been sort of systematically chipped away at and broken down. And poets like Simon Armitage, very modern kind of sensibility, idea about what poetry is, sees poetic value in all language, in everyday language, the kind of ordinary language that ordinary people use. So any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. So this idea of you need two people to measure properly. Now that's not a comment on sort of DIY and measuring up. It's going to take on a lot of metaphorical meaning. You come to help me measure windows. Okay, there's something about this. You come to help me measure that feels reliable. There's a sense of duty. That it feels the way it's expressed. You come. It's expressed in the present tense that makes it feel like a habit. It feels habitual. You come to help me measure, and without any qualms or qualifications or reluctance. Just you come to help me. Is what you do. You come to help me measure windows, pelmets, doors, the acres of the wall. So now we start to get this. Shift into, so from this kind of basics, shift into more figurative language, acres and prairies of the floors. If we think acres and prairies, we've got this kind of sense of vast expanse of space. Prairies, you would be perfectly reasonable in being reminded of the kind of Wild West. These kind of huge vistas, huge spaces, and obviously this is almost the possibility of new experiences. The prairies of the floors, the acres of the walls, these huge spaces, not literally huge, but figuratively huge. This is a new space in which this adult is going to be living. He's moving into a new place, moving out of his mother's house, and there's a sort of exciting possibility about that independence, and that's what I'm getting from prairies and acres. Because those are words that we use to describe huge spaces, but they're used in this kind of figurative sense. You at the zero end, think of that and the connection between zero end and birth. Me with the spool of tape, recording length, reporting meters, centimeters, back to base. This great line, okay? This idea of the mother as the base. Don't forget, think about the sort of visual aspect, the spool of tape. And the umbilical cord, this connection to the mother that's being pulled out, then leaving up the stairs. then leaving. That's a very poignant moment. Leaving, moving away from the mother, then leaving up the stairs, the line still feeding out, unreeling, years between us. So again, we've got this sort of shift into figurative language, that there's this shift between us, this growing up. It's a poem about growing up. And then we've got this fantastic set of two words punctuated by the full stops: anchor and kite. A kite, to fly, needs to be anchored to a fixed point. If you let go of the string or the cord, okay, the kite will fly off and become sort of chaotic and untethered. So the mother is the anchor and the child is the kite, able to fly and have this sort of freedom, all the time anchored by the presence of the mother. Very moving. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms. Climb the ladder to the loft. So we've got this interesting kind of connection with the exploration of space. So it's a combination of sort of freedom and, some danger. Think about going on a spacewalk. Must feel incredibly freeing, and yet at the same time kind of terrifying. And then in many ways, moving out of the mother's home seems to be something similar. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms. Climb. So again, some interesting words left sort of hanging at the end of lines. Climb. This idea of kind of moving up and beyond. Climb the ladder to the loft, to breaking point. So think about this spool of tape almost being pulled across the house further and further. Remember what this spool of tape, the tape measure is coming to kind of represent as a metaphor. It's being pulled further and further and further to breaking point. So this is about the relationship between the mother and the son, where something has to give. So the sort of parent-child dynamic has to give because it's being pulled so taut. 2 floors below your fingertips. This is a slight note of 2 floors below. Perhaps this is just my reading. 2 floors below. Possible connection with the idea of being, that the mother is kind of below, and without being too sort of morbid and grim, that there is a point where the mother is going to be, at least metaphorically below ground, not going to be around anymore, going to be deceased. And I think there's a little bit of a note there with the choice of the word below. 2 floors below, your fingertips still pinch. This is interesting. There's a sort of like mild pain, and I think my interpretation of that, my reading of that, okay, is that the sort of parent-child relationship can pinch. It can be, start to feel restrictive. You probably noticed this as a teenager, that you're not a child anymore, so therefore the kind of relationship starts to become kind of pinched, that the parent doesn't want to let go of that child. You do hear it from parents about, they grow up too quickly, or they seem so grown up now that they want to hold on to that moment where the child is the child, rather than sort of let go and realise that they're increasingly their own person. The last 1/100th of an inch is being pulled further and further, okay, but the mother's still holding on to this tiny little kind of final part of the tape measure. I reach towards a hatch that opens. I mean, this is interesting. This becomes a kind of like the image of birth, or a kind of rebirth into adulthood, that opens on an endless sky to fall or fly. Obviously, sky and fly. This is about possibility, but don't forget we can fall. This is the possibility of failure, of a lack of success. But who's still there? The mother's still there. Okay, at the other end. But it's being pulled further and further. It's a beautiful, poignant poem, emotional poem that gets us to reflect on the relationship between a mother and, I think probably it's reasonable to say the mother and the adult son, and that idea of their relationship becoming, kind of simultaneously strained and yet is still essential. The anchor and the kite, the child as the kite soaring, always, when it comes down to it, anchored by the presence of the mother. Whether they fall or fly, the mother is still going to be there. Sometimes it might pinch that relationship, sometimes they're still holding on and can't let go, but they're still the anchor when it comes down to it. So, beautiful poem, lots to think about. Kind of uneven in terms of its rhythm. There isn't a sort of neat rhythm. There are lots of halts and pauses, frequent use of caesura, okay, so the big pauses in the middle of lines caused by either commas or sometimes even more definite with a full stop. Some lines end stopped, particularly at the end of stanzas. There's a sort of sense of pausing and reflection. But it's kind of unsteady. There isn't a neat rhythm. If we have a neat rhythm and a neat rhyme scheme, which we don't have, then it can very, very easily lead to a situation where a poem becomes kind of sing-song, and that just wouldn't feel right. There is a slightly off-kilter kind of uneven structure, and the purpose of this, so if we're thinking about the patterns, there isn't a neat rhyme scheme. Doors, floors, yeah, okay, recording, leaving, we get these sort of half rhymes, recording, leaving, unreeling, yeah, kind of rhymes. Then kite, climb, something, give, pinch, reach. Pinch and reach. It's not a rhyme, but there's the kind of final sound, chords there, and then we have a rhyme at the end. So there's nothing sort of definite. It is uneven, and there's this sort of sense of unsteadiness about the poem, and I think is suggestive of an unsteady kind of relationship between the mother and the child, potentially the adult son. As we've said before, really important in Simon Armitage poems, colloquial language. Yes, it's figurative, yes, it's metaphorical, but it doesn't have the kind of flowery, elevated language that, a couple hundred years ago people would consider to be properly poetic. This is, on the face of it, is a mother helping her child who's moved out, becoming, an adult, living on their own. They're moved out and they're helping them measure up. But this sort of, what it does is takes a sort of a kind of powerful moment. Well, kind of probably better to call it a sort of personal, everyday moment, and sees in that poetic potential. I think that's very, very important, that there's a kind of poetry to even these sort of ordinary everyday moments in our life that sometimes we don't reflect upon. And what's great about this poem is that it definitely does cause us to reflect on that. So really, really great poem. What we're going to be doing over the next few lessons is working through a series of these sorts of poems, thinking very carefully about them. What I would recommend as well is, share it with someone at home. Read through the poem. Obviously, watch this video closely. Think about it. Reflect on it. Do you agree with me on my interpretations? Do you slightly disagree in any areas? And then share it with the people at home. Read it to people at home, because I think that people's parents, mums, dads, stepmums, stepdads, whoever you live with, would find this a very, very moving, thoughtful, thought-provoking poem. Okay, but as ever, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this one.